everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Alex and today I get to exposit about my 10 favorite classic horror tropes and ask you for recommendations. I had a realization a couple months ago that the bulk of the horror that I have read has been Stephen King, and while that's technically fine, I'm looking to inject some variety into my horror reading. I'm looking for some recommendations that are a little bit outside of my scope but fit into one of these 10 horror tropes. So my request from you is that as the video goes along and you see the different tropes, leave me a comment down below with whatever book you would like to recommend for that trope. One book will be selected from each trope recommendation to make it onto my Christmas list for this year, so be sure to write me a short little elevator pitch, I mean no more than 2 to 3 sentences per book, so that you can tell me exactly why you think that that book should be one that I read. And now that you've gotten the assignment, let's dive right in. Trope number 1 is going to be children as the protagonists. There is something so engaging about children fighting some great evil that either adults can't see or they completely ignore. Children have that perfect combination of a wild imagination and pure belief. They think that their ideas will work, and they're also willing to rely on their friends to help them with their plans. One classic example, of course, is going to be It by Stephen King, but another that I'd like to throw in there is actually The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. Now, you could technically argue that this is more of a dark fantasy, but it definitely has some horror elements, and I think it deserves to be included. Trope number 2 is going to be body horror. I recently read Hell Followed With Us, and I really enjoyed this. I felt like the body horror went really hard in this book, including for the protagonist, which was something that I didn't expect to actually happen. The idea of people turning into monsters and no longer having total control of their bodies or their minds is a great concept for horror, and you can do so much with it. Hell Followed With Us was a YA body horror story, so I definitely think an adult body horror would probably be more gruesome and probably go a little bit harder. Not to mention that it would probably also remove a lot of the romance elements that YA always seems to have trappings of. So if you can provide me some adult body horror recommendations, I would really appreciate that. Trope number 3 is going to be virus, plague, fungi, and parasites. This trope is one of my favorites. I love a good survivor story where the population of the world has either been decimated or we're actively watching as a disease is spreading. Because this trope has overlaps with sci-fi and with horror, I already gave some examples in that other video if you'd like to go check it out, but the one that I didn't mention was, of course, The Stand. The Stand is not sci-fi horror, it's just straight horror. And I read the uncut version of The Stand, which was over 1,400 pages, so I was definitely dedicated to this trope, and I thought that it was great. And if you can't think of a virus or a plague book, no worries, because I also really do love the fungi and the parasites. This idea of this organism that has taken control of a person's body, and you can either tell that they've been taken control of, or you can't. Both of them have really excellent horror elements. I can also definitely see where this would have some overlap with body horror, so feel free for those two things to overlap. Trope number 4 is going to be supernatural menace, because what is more intrinsic to horror than a supernatural force with an agenda? Maybe these creatures feed on the fear and anger of humans, like in Gilchrist, which I greatly enjoyed. Or maybe it's an entity that wants to take humans and turn them into creatures just like them, like in Salem's Lot. The Outsider is a great example as well, because the creature in here has the ability to transform into the shape of another person and essentially frame them for murder. Or you can have a story like Bird Box, where the creatures in it aren't necessarily evil, they just drive people crazy. On the flip side of that, trope number 5 is going to be just some guy. Because what is more terrifying than a supernatural force? People being evil. It feels real and makes a reader have that thought of, this could happen to me, and it also removes any plausible deniability that it's fiction. I tend to squirm a little bit more with these stories than with supernatural books, so perfect examples would be Misery or Mr. Mercedes. I cannot stress to you enough though, when it comes to this particular trope, please do not recommend me books that have any focus on animal abuse. My heart absolutely can't take it. That is the biggest trigger for me in any book. Like most things in horror stories, they don't bother me. Anything bad happening to animals, can't take it. So please just exclude those for my sake. Trope number 6 is going to be nightmares as reality. An example of this that I enjoyed was Sleeping Beauties. An example that I didn't was House of Leaves. So that might help steer you a little bit. So some examples of things that I like in this trope might be that our main character falls asleep and their dream world is just as real as the waking world. Maybe it's some type of fever dream where we have a really hard time telling what's real and what's fake, and for that matter, so does our main character. Maybe there's a monster that shows up in someone's dream and it actually is able to escape into the real world. Maybe their imagination brings it to life. I like things like that as long as our main character is likable enough. They don't have to be reliable, but they have to be at least somewhat likable. Trope number 7 is going to be haunted house. This had to make it to the list because it's literally the iconography we use for Halloween, and it is the season. Bonus points will always be awarded to a book that demonstrates the haunted house trope if they also show the perspectives of the ghosts. I know Grady Hendrix recently wrote a book about a haunted house, though admittedly I don't know much about it because I haven't read it yet. That might end up being on this list. Now, I've watched The Haunting of Hill House. I haven't read the book, but I absolutely love the show. The closest thing book-wise that I have read to this trope, sadly, is The Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware. And if you know anything about that plot, just know that if you give me something that falls within that vein too, that is also acceptable for this trope. Trope number 8 is going to be portal to another world. This trope is kind of similar to Nightmare as Reality, but it's not necessarily the same. I'm looking for something where our character either goes through a portal or walks through a doorway and they go to maybe a dark version of our world, or maybe some sort of like very bizarre world that is completely unlike ours. Maybe it's an inverse of our reality. Anything of that nature would be a lot of fun. Some examples of this, of course, could be The Talisman by Stephen King and Peter Straub. The Talisman, I wasn't a huge fan of, but the other example that I have is Pan's Labyrinth, which I think absolutely does fall into this trope. Trope number 9 is going to be trapped or stranded. Survival horror is great, especially when you can take a group of people and put them all in one isolated place. Inevitably, there's going to be some politics, division of resources, and probably murder when two warring factions are created and they start butting heads with one another. The most classic example of this, of course, is going to be Lord of the Flies. Last, but certainly not least, at trope number 10 is going to be possession or mind control. We could be talking about demons or spirits, or maybe some sort of mad scientist that creates a mind control device that gets people to do his bidding. Possession to me is probably a bit more compelling, but I did read a pretty good novel that focused on mass hypnosis, so that's also an option. Probably my favorite example of this trope is going to be Needful Things. The premise of this story is that there is a shopkeeper who arrives in a small town and everyone who pays him a visit leaves with something that they desperately want. And the possessive feeling that these townspeople have over the items that they receive in the shop ends up kind of driving everyone crazy. And that is all that I have for you today in my top 10 classic horror tropes video. I really hope that you enjoyed it. If you have any tropes in particular that you're fond of, please let me know about them down in the comments. I would love to hear about it. And please leave me those recommendations. I want some good things to ask for Christmas this year, and I need your all's help, so can't wait to look at those comments. And as always, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, that you all stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.